Hello, I'm Kirsty and I will be presenting this video with Anisa. We are both statistical programmers too at Veramed. We will be discussing our experiences as first-time lead programmers in both randomised clinical trials and real-world evidence studies. In this video, we will be discussing 5 main topics. These are our backgrounds and experiences, what we think a lead programmer is responsible for and the skill sets required to be one, what randomised clinical trials and real-world evidence studies are and the differences between the two, our experiences as first-time lead programmers on a randomised clinical trial and real-world evidence study and what we have learnt from this, and our tips for your first time as a lead programmer.
Before we get started, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our background and experiences. So Kirsty and I both studied maths at the University of Reading. This was a 4-year course where one of those years was a year in industry. Kirsty worked at Abbott Diabetes Care and I worked at Amgen, and this is where we were first introduced to the industry. We gained experience from TFL and dataset programming to raising data queries, and during this time we also learned how to use SAS. After graduating in 2017, we both joined Veramed on their graduate training program. So Veramed is a contract research organisation, or CRO, so we support the pharmaceutical and biotech industries, and this means that all the work that we do is client-facing.
Veramed has a graduate training program, which will also be referred to as the GTP. This is open to both statisticians and programmers. This program lasts 3 months, with this intake including graduates who span all the Veramed offices. All graduates joining the program start the first 2 weeks in the Twickenham office, so that they can all become well acquainted with each other and meet other Veramed employees. Many social activities are arranged so that the Veramed employees and the new graduate intake can get to know each other in a more relaxed environment. This includes activities such as pub visits, pizza lunches, quizzes, and ping pong tournaments. Due to the current pandemic, this year's graduate training programme is being held virtually, although graduates can go into the office if they would like. Therefore, Veramed are looking for new ways to ensure that graduates do not miss meeting their fellow employees on a social level, and to make sure that the GTP runs as smoothly as before. So Veramed are holding events such as virtual pub quizzes, virtual bingo, and virtual yoga. There are now longer training sessions with extra breaks, icebreaker quizzes at the start of each training session, a quiz on the first Friday of the graduate training programme, where previous graduates will do a round each, and there will also be extra support, so each graduate will be assigned a mentor, a buddy, and a line manager. No previous knowledge of SAS is assumed, so throughout the graduate training programme, SAS is introduced. Skills start to be developed through the use of a SAS guidance book and a dummy study. Throughout the first month or so of the graduate training programme, fellow employees do 15-minute introductions about themselves. This enables the graduates to learn about how their fellow colleagues got to Veramed, and also gives Veramed employees the chance to learn about the graduates on a one-to-one basis. At the start of the graduate training programme, the pharmaceutical industry is introduced, with more focused trainings on specific parts of the industry being presented further into the programme. This includes roles of the wider clinical team, for example, data managers and clinicians. Each graduate is assigned a mentor, in which they start with having an hour weekly meeting, in which they can discuss any questions or issues they have. This also gives each graduate someone they can reach out to easily, if they want to ask any questions or need help with SAS out of the scheduled meetings. Each graduate is also assigned a line manager, who they will initially have weekly meetings with and can discuss any issues they may be having. During the later stages of the graduate training program, graduates are assigned study work so they can start implementing the skills they have developed in SAS and about the industry and therapeutic areas. Anisa and I had both worked on various studies in different phases and therapeutic areas before being asked to be lead programmers.
We are now going to talk about what we think a lead programmer is responsible for and some of the skills which are important to have. So as Kirsty said, we've had experience working in a number of different therapeutic areas, including oncology, respiratory, and infectious diseases. After having had this experience, we were given the role of lead programmer on a study of our own. Throughout this process, we received support from our line managers at Veramed, as well as other lead programmers. And with this experience, we think that there are certain key skills which are needed to be an effective lead programmer. The first one is to be able to lead a team. You would usually have an internal team of Veramed programmers working on the dataset and TFL programming, so it's important to be able to delegate workload and ensure that everyone in your team is aware of what needs to be done and the timelines of when it needs to be done by. An important part of this is being able to answer any programming questions that your team might have. As a CRO, you would need to communicate with the client. This may be through weekly meetings or via email, so it's important to be able to convey information clearly and concisely. Having good organisation and time management skills is also important. As a lead programmer, you would need to take on a variety of different tasks, and from raising data queries to collating TFLs and delivering to the client. So staying organised will help you complete these tasks on time. You may also receive last-minute requests. For example, if the client requests an additional table to be produced, it's important to know how to prioritise your workload to be able to meet this request. But also, being able to negotiate timelines is another aspect needed to be a good lead programmer. And finally, identifying future risks. This is quite challenging, I think, to know what might cause a delay in delivering to the client, and I think it comes with experience. It might be issues within the data or technical problems, which mean that the delivery is at risk. So letting the client know in advance is important. So these are just a few key skills that we think are important, but there are many more which we have developed as lead programmers.
There are many responsibilities that come with being a lead programmer. Lead programmers are responsible for the oversight of the programming tasks throughout the entire course of a study. So they will be involved in decisions from study setup all the way through to archiving. Lead programmers are often involved in wider discussions about the study, with other team members such as clinicians and data management. Therefore, communication skills must be adapted to the audience in which you are talking to. For example, it wouldn't be helpful to discuss dataset variable names and how a situation would be coded in SAS with a clinician, as they do not know SAS, so it wouldn't be relevant to them. But this may be how you wish to discuss tricky data issues with your internal statistics and programming team. It is very important to develop a collaborative professional working relationship with the client and the internal lead statistician on your study. This is to ensure that any issues can be communicated effectively and efficiently. Lead programmers can also be responsible for the organisation of the statistical and programming meetings, compiling the agendas needed for these meetings, and carrying out the minute taking whilst the meeting is happening. It's very important to take minutes during any meeting to ensure that any decision made has been formally captured. Throughout the course of the study, lead programmers support team members with any questions and queries they may have about programming, the background of the study, the SAP, the shells, or the dataset specifications.
Kirsty and I are lead programmers on two different types of studies, so we're just going to go through what they are and the differences between them. The first one is a randomised clinical trial. These types of trials can contribute to the approval of a drug by the regulatory agencies, such as the FDA. In a randomized clinical trial, you're comparing one or more treatment groups with a control group, and this could be the standard of care or a placebo. Patients are randomized into one of these groups, and this is done to avoid bias. In some trials, various different treatments are compared, so there is no control group as such. Some trials can be blinded, and there are different types of blinding which are used to reduce bias. A double-blinded trial is when neither the patient nor physician knows what treatment has been allocated. A single-blinded trial is when the physician knows the treatment, but the patient does not. And open-label studies are used to describe studies which do not contain any blinding. And this may be for ethical reasons. Here, both patient and physician knows the treatment that has been allocated. And finally, some treatments can't be blinded. For example, if a treatment is known to cause a specific adverse event, then blinding would not be appropriate. In most randomized clinical trials, data for each patient is collected through a case report form or a CRF. A CRF is a form or questionnaire which is designed to collect all the protocol required information from each subject in the trial, and this makes each CRF unique to the study. The population will contain people with similar characteristics so that the results can be compared, and the criteria for the population would be defined in the study protocol. There are other types of clinical trials as well. So it might be unethical to enroll a subject in a study which contains a placebo group. For example, oncology trials or studies involving rare diseases. And this is usually because not giving experimental treatment would almost certainly cause the patient's health to get worse. Another type is dose selection. This is where multiple doses of the same treatment is tested. And this would usually occur quite early on in the study, when a decision needs to be made as to which dose to take forward for the rest of the study.
Real-world evidence studies are also referred to as RWE. These studies are conducted on observational data on the usage of a medical product obtained in a real-world setting to investigate how subjects use the medicine in their day-to-day life. This data is collected during routine clinical practice and outside the context of a randomized clinical trial setting. Therefore, there is not specifically designed clinic visits a subject has to attend. They just go whenever they would usually make an appointment to see their physician. Real-world evidence studies are used to inform healthcare professionals in the decision-making process of how a drug works in a real-world setting. These types of studies are used to evaluate drug effectiveness, safety, and the benefit or risk of the drug in the real world and out of the context of a randomized clinical trial setting. They are also used to contribute to countries' reimbursement and policy decisions. Real-world evidence studies often have challenging data for the study team to contend with. This is due to the data not being collected for clinical trial research. So, for example, there is no schedule of events at specific time points. Real-world data often contains duplicate data, which can be both true and false. The study team would need to make decisions as to how they will deal with these types of data issues to ensure it's being applied consistently over multiple datasets. There is often missing data and free text fields, which can make summarizing the data extremely challenging. Different coding systems can also be used in different countries, so the statistics and programming team may need the help of the wider clinical team to align this data.
There are many differences between these two types of studies. The first difference is that randomized clinical trials are interventional. Patients here are put into treatment groups so that the results can be compared. Whereas in a real-world evidence study, patients are observed in a real-world setting. The population selection is also different. Patients in a randomized trial are carefully selected, and this is based on a long list of inclusion and exclusion criteria, which would be outlined in the study protocol. Whereas the population in a real-world evidence study is broad and inclusive, with fewer exclusion criteria. Randomized studies will focus on efficacy under controlled conditions. and real-world studies will focus on effectiveness under close to normal conditions. But the main difference is that data from a randomized clinical trial is collected in a controlled environment with the intention of assessing efficacy, whereas data from a real-world evidence study is obtained through daily clinical practice with the purpose of assessing long-term effectiveness.
We will now be discussing our first experiences of being a lead programmer and what we have learned from this. From being a lead programmer for the first time, I have learned that organisational tasks can take a lot longer than expected. For example, setting up the QC tracker, creation of shells, and assigning team members work. We also found that we didn't have as much time for programming datasets and TFLs on the study as anticipated. Therefore, we had to distribute some of these programming tasks we had assigned to ourselves to other team members. This was to ensure that the oversight role of lead programmer could be carried out effectively and efficiently. I found attending meetings with the wider clinical study team, such as data management and clinicians, daunting to start with, as the agenda items aren't always topics that a lead programmer would be particularly knowledgeable in. But I soon found my confidence in these meetings grow as my knowledge of the study and data grew. I find the items discussed in wider clinical study team meetings very interesting, as it can raise questions about the study data that you often haven't thought of as a programmer. Clinicians are often looking for different data abnormalities compared to what a programmer would look for. For example, a lead programmer may look at the data at an individual record level to flag values which don't look correct, whereas a clinician may look at the overall data for a particular country and spot that the usual dose of medication isn't being prescribed and may query as to why. When I first became a lead programmer, I found it challenging overseeing colleagues with a lot more experience in the industry, as I felt that I was still learning myself. But I soon found that all colleagues are happy to share their experiences and knowledge to enable you to be an effective lead programmer as possible. It is important to ensure that the latest standards are being implemented in your study, and to keep checking that you are using the required versions of the code list such as MedRA, as these may change throughout the course of your study, as your study may span over multiple years.
We have learnt a variety of skills as a lead programmer. Managing a team of programmers was a new experience, but this ensured that all programming for a delivery was complete. This involved distributing workload and keeping the team up to date with any changes in the timelines, but also answering any questions that they had. We've become confident in implementing standards such as CDISC or client-specific standards to ensure that we are compliant with the programming requirements of the study. Communicating with the client was a new challenge. We have learned how to negotiate timelines as well as keeping the client up to date with the study progress. This was usually done through scheduled meetings where we also took the opportunity to ask questions and raise any potential issues. We have learnt what factors can cause potential risks to delivery, whether that be data issues or technical issues, and discussing this with the client if needed. As a lead programmer, we've been able to really learn about the therapeutic area as well as anything in the data which is unique to the disease area that we're working in. And finally, we've had lots of opportunities for self-learning. We have sent numerous deliveries and learned how we can improve for the next one each time, which has enabled us to deliver quality work to the client.
Finally, we will be discussing our tips for your first time as a lead programmer. I found it important to create a strong working relationship with my internal study team at Veramed to ensure that tasks were being completed as efficiently as possible, and to ensure that the communication of tasks was effective. It is also important to build a good relationship with the client, statistician, and programmer, as you will work closely with them throughout the course of the study, but also the wider client team members such as data management, as you may spend a lot of time discussing data queries you have with them. As a lead programmer, you need to ensure you keep organised, especially with documents such as the QC tracker, shells, and analysis plan. This is to ensure the documents are always aligned, which enables the rest of the study team to work as efficiently as possible. It is important to know when the programming of datasets and TFLs on the study isn't enabling you to spend enough time doing the role of lead programmer, and therefore to know when to redistribute work to enable you to then take on more of an oversight role.
It's important to make sure that you know about the relevant processes and documentation. This could be ensuring that your study is following CDISC standards if applicable, or making sure that you're using the latest version of any dictionaries and documentation. But it is also important to become familiar with processes such as the QC process or what needs to be done for a delivery. We have learned that it is useful to have a checklist of tasks which need to be completed for a delivery. We have found this particularly useful as it has helped us ensure that all the required tasks for a delivery were correct and complete. If your company does not have one, then consider creating one yourself, as you will be able to reuse it across different studies. And finally, don't be afraid to ask more senior programmers for advice and for any questions you might have throughout the course of a study. This will help you learn and develop and help you become an effective lead programmer. Any questions?